You've probably heard it said before that the best laid plans never survive first contact with the enemy, and at least for me and Michigan Mashup this year, that was very, very true. So this right here is what's left of the main robot of Nylon Brigade. As a comparison, I have the complete robot. This is an alternative one that never fought, sitting right over here. And you can see there are a number of components missing off this particular build of the robot. And we'll get into some more details about that in just a bit. But I want to begin where the last video left off, where I was preparing for this event. And in the photo where I showed both these robots ready to go, there's a bit of an ominous sign hidden away in there that I didn't see in the photo, and I didn't catch, like in reality, I guess we'll say real life, as the kids like to say these days. Do kids still say that? I don't know. But I didn't catch it until about a day before the event, and things got a little bit worse from there. And what I'm referring to is this missing piece right here on the front of the weapon cage. I have it highlighted in this photo. Now, at some point during the final testing of this robot, the front piece of the polycarbonate weapon cage here broke off, and it broke along where the weapon axle goes through, because there's some really thin parts of the polycarbonate around the 1/4 inch diameter axle. And during the last final testing, some of the last few minutes of testing, it snapped. However, the drive belt, the tension that it has in terms of holding the whole weapon system in place, is so tight that it didn't cause the actual weapon to fail. So I didn't actually catch this particular broken piece until, like I said, the day before the event. Fortunately, I was able to get it repaired, so it didn't seem like it was going to be that big of the deal. I thought it was just sort of a fluke accident. Then on the actual day of the event, as I was preparing the second robot, after I got everything weighed in, I noticed there's a small crack right here by the weapon axle, which of course only made the whole situation even more ominous and more concerning. And it got to the point where I'm thinking, maybe this design feature failure, or whatever you want to call it at this point, is going to actually be a real serious issue for the event. So anyway, I went ahead, I replaced this piece and just got ready for the fights, and hopefully things are going to work out not too awful. So polycarbonate as a material is very tough and it's incredibly impact resistant. However, when it does fail, it tends to fail very catastrophically. Now, straight up pieces of 1/4 inch polycarbonate are probably tough enough for dealing with most ant weights. The problem is the design that I have here for the weapon cage, I have several holes drilled in the piece. One obviously for the weapon axle, and then I have several more further back in the chassis here to where various bolts attach the weapon cage to the chassis. And every time you drill a hole through a piece of polycarbonate, you're introducing a new area where a potential failure can occur, because you're essentially reducing the structural integrity of that area of the polycarbonate. In particular, where the weapon shaft goes through, between where the shaft is and the top of the weapon cage piece, there's very little material. And that proved to be the most common weak point in this design when it came to absorbing impacts from enemy robots, or frankly, as I discovered a little bit ago, absorbing impacts from Nylon Brigade's own weapon. Now let's take a look at some of the fights and just see how that particular design flaw ended up working itself out. So first up was a robot named Retribution. It was a dual disc vertical spinner with a 4-wheel drive. And what I'd like to say, and I think it's kind of accurate to say this, is that for the most part, Nylon Brigade worked pretty well. My tactic was pretty much get around from the sides, do not go weapon to weapon and try to engage him. And like I said, hit from the side, hit from the back, and at least at one point here, I do a pretty good job of that. And Nylon Brigade's improved weapon does kind of toss him up, and I can actually, manipulate enemy robots a little bit with this tiny little weapon that I have. However, that only worked for so long, and eventually I did get one weapon-to-weapon engagement. And this is not the one that disabled my main weapon in this fight. My main weapon is still functioning. About a minute or so left in the fight. We make one more weapon-to-weapon contact, and this is where both of our weapon systems go down. At this point, the structural damage to the robot occurs. I lose one of my weapon cage pieces, and with his case, Retribution has 2 belts that are driving the weapon system, and this impact caused both those belts to pop off, twist, and wrap around together, and it gummed up his weapon system like that. From this point on, it was pretty much I guess a pushing match. Not too terribly exciting, but it's kind of surprising how close both of us each almost drove into the pit at least once. But at the end of the day, it went to a judge's decision, which I lost, as I've yet to win a judge's decision ever. But in this case, I was probably a fair conclusion that Retribution did legitimately win this fight. Being an early round fight, I assumed that I probably had a decent amount of time to my next particular battle. So instead of throwing the alternative robot into combat, I went ahead and fixed the one that kind of got beaten up here. And another piece of damage I did discover was that one of the bearings inside the weapon system here, there's a little bearing that's actually inside each of the tiny little weapon blades. One of those shattered, so I had to replace that on top of fixing the weapon cage. My second fight was up against a robot named Jeff, and he was actually pitted next to me, and I found out that he was going to be my opponent because apparently he was looking at the bracket and asked out loud, "What's a Nylon Brigade?" Now this robot was an undercutter, and the fight started out fairly well for me. Once again, I think I was doing pretty good at the start. In fact, his weapon wasn't even working. I got a few quick hits in at the start. I kind of outmaneuvered him, carried around a bit, and for the most part, I seemed to have a little bit more control at the start of the fight. And as you can see here, Jeff's antenna sticks out the back, and that was kind of my main target. Unfortunately, the undercutter went around most of the robot, and very frequently, once it got up and spinning, it would start hitting my weapon in a weapon-to-weapon contact situation, which wasn't necessarily the worst thing. But after about several of these hits, my weapon cage shattered again. And at this point, the weapon itself is somewhere across the arena, and without my main weapon to defend myself, pretty much every hit went to something bad. He's slicing off tires, damaging the hubs. He took out both of the drive belts, and at the end, I was counted down because I only had one drive wheel semi-functional. I'll talk a bit more about that in just a moment. And because of that whole weight distribution thing, the fact that I was missing some tires up front, my one good rear drive wheel was not getting much traction. Probably the bend of armor didn't help either. And that's how this particular fight ended. And in this case, for the second loss, this would be the end of the Michigan Mashup for me. Well, there you go. That is the robot after fighting Jeff. Oh, and there's the weapon too. I managed to pull that out of the box. It looks really bad. The armor band itself was not destroyed. I gave that away as a trophy to the other driver. As for the wheel back here that's missing, it was still attached to the robot. However, what happened was the Candy Wasp drive hubs that I run here, they just came loose somehow, and therefore this back wheel was not contributing at all to the drive power of the robot, and that's part of the reason why I basically got stuck, got counted out. And even though it does look really awful, I didn't suffer that much damage in terms of money. It's mostly plastic pieces that are 3D printed that I can replace, and a pair of crappy weapon cages that are gonna get redesigned anyway. The weapon seems to be in good shape. There was a little bit of scrapes to the weapon motor itself, and this damage actually down here was done by Retribution. There's a little bit of scraping up there, but that piece right there where the armor attaches is ripped off, so the chassis is no good anyway. Now, there are a number of small changes I want to make to the robot. In particular, things like the wheel position needs to be adjusted just a bit. I need to raise them up, because what's happening is there's not a lot of clearance between basically the lid of the robot and the wheel when it's running upside down, and I had some trouble with that during testing. I got to be very careful how I put the lid on, so I'd like to buy myself a little more flexibility in that regard so that I get more reliability when I'm running upside down. Also, I want to change up how the armor attaches to the robot. I'll talk more about this in a future video, but essentially the armor attachments are designed for a UHMW armor band, which I'm not using anymore. I got some more ways with 3D printing to attach things. I think it'd make the robot faster to fix because it'll be easy to remove and install new armor plates. But of course, the big thing is going to be the weapon cage itself. I've demonstrated here that this weapon cage is not sufficient whatsoever. Now, the exact details of what I'm doing, I'm not 100% sure about, but the big change is going to be a material switch. I'm going to go from polycarbonate over to UHMW, and the main reason for this switch is how the materials fail. UHMW, though it's far less impact resistant and pretty much even the slightest bit of hit to it will take off a little bit of material, this does not fail catastrophically like polycarbonate does, which means these weapon cage pieces are going to be more resilient not only from enemy impacts, they're going to basically be able to hold up longer against enemy impacts as well as impacts from my own weapon. Also, as a bonus, UHMW is about 80% as dense as polycarbonate, so therefore I can get away with either adding more material to my weapon cage pieces, or I can increase their thickness to make their durability a little bit better. But I'm going to go ahead and take care of that in the not too distant future, because what's going on is there are a few more events planned in the area, and I would like to take my robot here, Nylon Brigade, to those events to see how the new ideas work out when it comes to actual combat. Therefore, instead of doing a total rebuild like I did from version 1 to version 2 here, I'm going to go ahead and kind of patch in my ideas, maybe 1 or 2 things at a time, and then see how they work in a new combat setting. So if you want to follow that process along, go ahead and hit subscribe, because I'm Jason, the creator of the Team Rocket Robotics. I almost said Tabletop Battlefield, which is true, but that's not what I'm talking about today. Team Rocket Robotics is how I fight robots. So thank you guys all for watching, and I'll see you next time.